Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be doing a study with me or read with me. So today is Wednesday, June 2nd, and I'm doing my daily reading. And what I'll be doing is I'm going to read 10 minutes out loud of my book, and then I'll read 15 minutes silently. So I'll just be switching between reading aloud and reading in my head. Now the book I have here is The Chosen. Recently I was searching about history books and I found this book and it was really highly recommended. And I've been reading a little of it and it's quite interesting, so I'm going to continue reading it today. I'm going to start by reading out loud. And I will begin on page 31. There was little room at Groton for the boy of artistic or intellectual inclination. As his biographer admits, Peabody distrusted artists as genus, believing them to be a folk who have unreliable relationships with the world, the flesh, and the devil, with a consequent weakening of moral fiber. Nor was there much room for the independent spirit. In a letter to the parents of a boy whom Peabody suggested would get more from a different school, the young man, whose offenses were admittedly very slight, seems to have been guilty of the crime of being an individualist who has little in common with his surroundings. Peabody was fond of saying that a headmaster was to be a bit of a bully and needs to have the capacity to inflict pain. But in Groton's system of authority and control, it was often the students who used the harshest means to enforce conformity and to punish classmates judged deviant. For students deemed to be in violation of the school's rigid and sometimes mysterious code of etiquette, I think that's how you pronounce it, but please don't judge me if I don't, or who were felt to be lacking the right tone, often by showing insufficient deference to upperclassmen. The punishment could be brutal. George Biddle, of the class of 1904, describes what would happen when a student was judged to run afoul of school norms. The heaviest of the fourth formers, perhaps a dozen of them, grabbed the offender, jerked him off the ground, and ran him down the cellar stairway to the laboratories in approved football rush. A first offender was given only about 10 seconds. The water came from the open spigot with tremendous force, and the stream could be concentrated in violence by thumb and forefinger. Besides, the culprit was winded and frightened and held upside down during the pumping. He was forcibly drowned for 8 or 10 seconds. Then he was jerked up to his feet, coughing, choking, retching. If he hadn't had enough the first time, he was put under again for 10 seconds. Employed until the 1920s, pumping was carried out with the approval of the senior prefect, the school's highest-ranking school authority appointed by the headmaster, and the knowledge of the rector himself. Among those students pumped in the early years at Groton were Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who was judged fresh and swell-headed, the future Secretary of State, Dean Aitchison, cheeky, and Peabody's own son, Malcolm, bad-toed. The harsh atmosphere was part of a larger system of socialization that imposed on children of the privileged a willful regime of austerity and deprivation. These schools were hardening the sons of the elite for a life of command in which subordinates, whether inferior classes, ethnic or racial groups, or colonial natives, would often be disinclined to obey and would sometimes mount resistance. System of power and control at the elite boarding schools was devised to expose the young men who went through them to the experience of both obedience and command, often under trying conditions. Having survived institutionalized bullying, the graduates would have the necessary toughness to succeed in their future leadership positions. The Groton ethos, like that of the leading British public schools, was an uneasy admixture of two seemingly contradictory systems of belief: gentility and social Darwinism. On the one side, men such as Peabody were deeply committed to the nurturance of Christian gentlemen, men whose devotement to such virtues as honesty, integrity, loyalty, modesty, decency, courtesy, and compassion would constitute a living embodiment of Protestant ideals. But on the other side, life was viewed as a struggle in which the battle went to the strong, and those individuals and nations not manly enough to participate would be left remorselessly behind in a world in which only the fittest survived. The Christian gentleman thus had no choice but to be aggressive and even ruthless in order to win. Peabody's most important ally in promulgating this ideology was Theodore Roosevelt, who had been preaching the virtues of the, quote, strenuous life since the 1890s. A close friend of Peabody's and the father of a student, T.R. was a frequent visitor at Groton, where he unfailingly preached the virtues of a life of gentlemanly service to the public. In a speech on Groton's 20th anniversary in 1904, President Roosevelt told the students, "You are not entitled, either in college or life, to an ounce of privilege, because you have been to Groton, not an ounce, but we are entitled to hold you to exceptional accountability because you have been at Groton. Much has been given to you, therefore we have a right to expect much of you." Adherence to the philosophy of the, quote, strenuous life, Roosevelt believed, implied a duty toward the people living in barbarism to see that they are freed from their chains, and we can free them only by destroying barbarism itself. The Christian gentleman, then, was impelled on both moral and practical grounds to take up what some have called the gentleman's burden of responsibility. The responsibility in the wake of the Spanish-American War to, quote, fulfill duties to the nation and to the race, and to do our share of the world's work by bringing order out of chaos in the great fair tropic islands from which the valor of our soldiers has driven the Spanish flag. Peabody, whose beloved Cheltenham had sent many of its graduates to the Imperial Civil Service in India, shared Roosevelt's enthusiasm for America's fledgling empire. Indeed, even before the Spanish-American War ended, he wrote to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, offering Groton as a source of the officials who would need to administer the empire. Yet Peabody was not, as the historian James McLachlan has rightly noted, a howling imperialist. He simply believed that if America was to have an empire, it should be a progressive empire, honestly administered by well-educated gentlemen, pure, clean, and Christian. Peabody's proposal to Lodge was an expression of his abiding commitment to public service. Inscribed in the school's motto, Cui servire est regner, to serve is to regan. The emphasis on service was at once a notable and altruistic ideal and an expression of a deeply embedded assumption that the type of young men who went to Groton would and should rule America. In Season and Out, recalled Ellery Sedgwick, Sedgwick. In 1904, with President Theodore Roosevelt delivering the keynote address and Franklin, recently graduated from Harvard, in attendance, Peabody presided at a festive celebration of Groton's 20th anniversary. Prominent old Grotonians poured in from distant quarters, but the most visible sign of the school's remarkable success came from the presence of representatives from both Harvard and Yale, both of which conferred honorary degrees on the rector. And graduating Peabody a Master of Arts, Yale attached the citation, "What strength is to weakness, what experience is to ignorance or blind confidence, what light and faith are to darkness and doubt, what courage is to trembling fear, what the spiritual potter is to the pliant clay of youthful character, what Paul was to Timothy, all that is the headmaster of Groton School to the young manhood blessed with his devoted instruction and companionship." Harvard, still the destination of most Groton graduates, did Yale one better, conferring on the rector a doctorate of scarce theology. Its citation read, "Endicott Peabody, graduate of the English Cambridge, clergyman, headmaster of a school for boys that stands for purity, manliness, and helpfulness." In 2 short decades, Groton has established itself as the nation's most prestigious boarding school, exerting an influence that went far beyond the small group in which it originated. Yet Groton and comparable schools rarely spoke in public cultivating, quote, Christian gentlemen. Instead, they called for building character, a way of freeing the values embodied in the nation of a gentleman from their association with a particular social class. By conferring honorary degrees on Endicott Peabody, the quintessential Christian gentleman, Harvard and Yale were consecrating the educational and cultural ideas that he and his school represented. Implicit in these ideas was a particular definition of merit, one that considered character, manliness, and academic accomplishment as important as academic excellence. Less than 2 decades later, when Harvard, Yale, and Princeton adopted selective admissions policies and, for the first time, imposed a limit on the size of the freshman class, it was this definition that profoundly shaped the admissions criteria and the social composition of the Big Three. Chapter 2. The Big Three before selective admissions. If Endicott Peabody was the leading headmaster in the United States, then Harvard's Charles W. Eliot, 1834 to 1926, was the nation's leading college president. But to say that he was the most renowned figure in American higher education is to vastly understate his importance, for his influence went well beyond the academy. Dubbed First Citizen of the Republic by Theodore Roosevelt, whose feelings toward him were, at best, ambivalent, and referred to by Harvard's philosophy professor Ralph Barton Perry as, quote, advisor at large to the American people on things in general, Eliot was reverenced by both his peers in higher education and his fellow citizens. When he retired in 1909 after 40 years of service, he had succeeded not only in transforming Harvard, but in changing the definition of the great university. No college president, before or since, had exerted a greater impact on the shape and character of American higher education. Like Peabody, Eliot came from a distinguished Massachusetts family whose roots dated back to colonial times. His grandfather, perhaps the wealthiest Bostonian of his time, had endowed Harvard's Eliot Professorship of Greek. His father, Samuel Atkins Eliot, served as a mayor of Boston, as well as the treasurer of American College and ex officio member of the Harvard Corporation, Harvard's governing body. In a world in which a small and tightly connected group of families from the Protestant upper class effectively controlled both Harvard and Boston's major institutions, Eliot was Brahmin's Brahmin. Harvard, Eliot, Lowell, and the Clash of Visions. Though Eliot shared Peabody's background, his views on many matters differentiated sharply from those of the rector. A generally liberal and tolerant man, especially by the standards of his time and milieu, Eliot opposed the Spanish-American War, lending his name to a group of 85 Harvard professors against the fighting. Eliot, unlike Peabody, remained loyal to his Unitarian origins and adopted a broadly ecumenical view, with a goodly dose of skepticism toward established religious dogmas, including those of his own church. A firm believer in the freedom of religion, Eliot eliminated required chapel in 1886. An action not taken until 1926 at Yale and 1964 at Princeton. Institutional Christianity, he once wrote, could still be very un-Christ-like. A progressive on many social and political issues, including immigration, he opposed restriction, sex education, he favored it, and foreign policy, he had a strong preference for diplomacy over force. He was among the most liberal members of the Protestant elite, but his decidedly liberal views on educational matters had the greatest impact on Harvard. During his presidency, student freedom grew dramatically. Having little taste for regulating students, he cut the length of the student rulebook from 40 pages to 5, while radically increasing the number of courses offered. His most famous reform, one which had an enduring impact on American higher education, was the adoption of the elective system, in which students were almost entirely free to choose their own courses. Whether in the realm of curriculum or of private life, students at Harvard enjoyed a degree of freedom unknown at Yale or Princeton.